All right, ladies and gentlemen, sorry couldn't make it over to class today, but just as an opportunity for you guys to take a look at the final two things that we discussed in class today anyway. So a very short presentation in regards to the end of Jackson's presidency and what becomes known as the end of the Age of Jackson. In regards to the trouble brewing in South Carolina that we talked about yesterday, it comes to a culmination in 1832 when Jackson, thinking though he is doing the right thing, will have Congress pass a tariff that is actually going to lower the price of all imported goods. But instead of the South looking at that as being a means of a compromise, they see it as an insult because they don't want to see a tariff be passed that still is going to have any semblance of an import tax. They want to see the tariffs put away altogether. So, the analogy I used in class yesterday, if the tariff of 1828 had import tax rates at 10%, the tariff of 1832 is going to be at 5%. So it's still a tax, but by default, the products would be cheaper. Southerners do not accept this, especially in South Carolina. Led by John C. Calhoun in that question of nullification, the reality sets in that the South is willing to push the envelope a little bit. In 1832, we will see the South Carolina get together to pass what is known as the Nullification Act. What the Nullification Act stated after a convention in South Carolina was that the citizens of South Carolina were not going to pay any semblance or anything regarding an import tax. They are using their right to nullify or to cancel out that federal tax. And furthermore, to take this a step further, South Carolina said that if the federal government doesn't respect this act, that they would secede from the Union. So essentially what South Carolina says is if you guys don't allow us to nullify and cancel this out and not pay this tax, we will in fact become our own separate nation. So when Andrew Jackson gets word of this, that South Carolina is threatening secession over this tax, he is put into a difficult position and has to act immediately. If you think back to the Whiskey Rebellion, we said that Washington was put in a difficult set of circumstances when if farmers complaining about the whiskey tax, if he gave in to them and repealed that tax, what said that he wouldn't have to repeal other taxes on other items throughout the United States. So Jackson is going to act immediately and quite angrily, one would say, because he's not going to be messing around, especially with his political rival, John C. Calhoun, really pulling the strings in South Carolina. So what he does is he sends 7 naval warships to Charleston, South Carolina, thus blockading the port city. He mobilizes the American army and he has them sent into South Carolina and basically says that if those citizens in South Carolina do not pay a tax, they will be fined or put in jail. And if there's any retaliation because of that, he would be willing to use force. So, by many means, aggressively, Jackson is saying, hey, you guys have threatened secession. Well, I'm basically threatening war over this. I got to keep the United States together. Now, one of the big things that helped Jackson was that when South Carolina made this proclamation, so to speak, they anticipated other southern states to follow suit. The problem is no other states budge. North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, other states, they don't say that they are in the same boat as South Carolina and threaten secession over this. They're obviously very upset. They will not nullify the tax, and therefore South Carolina is on their own. Because of the way Jackson responds quite efficiently and the fact that there was no one else to back them up, South Carolina will wind up repealing the Nullification Act. So for them, it was a huge bluff, and it didn't pay off. Jackson called their bluff, and for Jackson, he's able to avoid not only a major war, but a split in the Union. Okay, imagine driving to Florida and leaving North Carolina, entering South Carolina. You had to take your passport out. That's essentially what the United States would have been like if this were to ever come to fruition. But going back to what I said yesterday, John C. Calhoun always argued that states' rights were more important. And the real underlying issue of what the nullification crisis is the fact that Southern states are concerned if the federal government was ever to go about and establish laws preventing slavery, they feel as though it should be a state's decision, not the federal government's decision in making decisions about slavery. So again, the big picture here, and just something to keep in mind moving forward, is the issue of slavery. Now, after 2 terms in office and 8 years, Jackson will step away like his predecessors and clears the way for the Democrat Martin Van Buren to run in the election of 1836 to continue the age of Jackson. The Whigs know full well that they do not have a credible candidate to run, so they wind up running three on the prospect of making sure that Van Buren does not win a majority. Unfortunately, though, for the Whigs, that plan is a disaster. Considering the fact that Jackson was still popular in Middle America, he was the president for the common man. That is what the Democrats campaign on. The Whigs didn't really have a credible candidate at the time in the election of 1836. So ultimately, Martin Van Buren, who had served as originally governor of New York, had served as Andrew Jackson's first Secretary of State. After Calhoun's resignation, he served as Andrew Jackson's vice president. So what better way to extend the so-called age of Jackson, with the 8th president of the United States being Martin Van Buren, one of Jackson's most trusted advisors. The problem for Van Buren in his presidency is that he is victim to circumstances beyond his control. In 1837, after his inauguration, Great Britain is going to go through a minor economic depression, and therefore they are not spending as much money. And while you might think that doesn't really affect us, it does when you consider that Great Britain is going to hold back on the purchasing of cotton. They're not going to be purchasing as much. So southern plantations are going to suffer because of this, and then indirectly northern manufacturers are going to suffer as well. It's during this time, due to Britain buying less cotton, that the United States enters into what is known as the Panic of 1837. The Panic of 1837 is exactly what you would think of. It's a panic. Unemployment becomes high, inflation becomes high, crop prices are falling. So therefore, when people aren't making money, they like to point fingers. And who are they pointing the finger directly at? Martin Van Buren. Van Buren is blamed for the economic collapse here in the United States. It's not a huge depression, but it's certainly not a moment where we saw an economic boom like we did in the after the War of 1812. So unfortunately for Martin Van Buren, a victim of circumstances really beyond his control. Due to his unpopularity heading into the election of 1840, he has a very difficult shot of becoming or winning a second term in office. This time around, the Whigs will nominate a war hero, William Henry Harrison, from the War of 1812, and even that predates the War of 1812. Taking a page out of George Washington and Andrew Jackson's playbook, he campaigns as the war hero. All right, at the time he is running, he is 67 years old, and he is going to defeat Martin Van Buren. And the election of William Henry Harrison marks the end of the age of Jackson. Why? Well, first and foremost, he's a Whig. All right, he is the first Whig elected as president. Okay, when you think about the Whigs and their what were they formed for? They were formed to oppose Andrew Jackson. So this victory is certainly well celebrated within the political party itself. For William Henry Harrison, at 67, he was at the time the oldest elected president, and he wanted to ensure to the American people that he was going to be a strong and viable president to get the United States out of this economic situation. On March 4th of 1841, Martin Van Buren will make the longest presidential inaugural address in our nation's history. In just over 2 hours long, William Henry Harrison, in the pouring rain, without a coat to keep him warm and to keep him dry, is going to days later get sick. An infection that goes to his lungs, it turns to pneumonia. And William Henry Harrison, unfortunately, on April 4th of 1841, will die in office. So he is, to this day, the shortest tenured president, only serving 30 days in office. So it's very difficult to assess his presidency when he was really bedridden for almost the entirety of his presidency here. So that will we'll see the fallout from that when we move on to the next few chapters here. All right, so that is really the only lesson that, a quick lesson today for this last slide. For your test tomorrow, it's 45 Scantron questions with a part 2, all right, standard test. Part 2 will not be asking you to describe anything, but rather short answers, all right, or listing of some sort. So just prepare for that. Partial credit will certainly be given. In addition to that, what should you study? This chapter, we did cover the presidents. Okay, so I would be familiar with James Monroe's presidency, John Quincy Adams' presidency, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, and even William Henry Harrison. And the reason I bring up those five is because really everything that was discussed happened on their watches, so to speak. So, who was president at the end of the age of Jackson? That marks the end of the age of Jackson. Harrison. Even with something simple as this last bullet point. Who was president during the Indian Removal Act? Well, it was Jackson. Well, what was the Indian Removal Act? You go from there. Who was president at the time of the Monroe Doctrine? Oh, okay, it's James Monroe. All right. Well, what was the Monroe Doctrine and what did it represent to the United States? So, if you go over those five presidents, I think in many ways it will take shape to studying a vast majority of the chapter. Be familiar with the election of 1824. Okay, the four candidates. Who became president in that election? Where was the controversy in that presidency? Be familiar with your key terms, political parties covered, and last but not least, there will be a section on your test that specifically caters to your worksheet that I asked you guys to work on today and even yesterday on the age of Jackson. It's things that really, in some ways, were reiterated in the notes, but specifically some facts that we discussed and highlighted yesterday. So I would definitely look to go over that. If you have any questions, obviously feel free to email me. If you have any concerns, please feel free to email me. I will be in my office here at the end of the day. And I will also obviously be here tomorrow morning if need be. All right. If you have any questions moving forward, feel free to always give me shoot me an email of some sorts. All right. Everyone take care. Again, sorry for not being there today. Just when things come up, sometimes they need my immediate attention, and today was one of those days. So thank you for being understanding, and I will see you all tomorrow.